What would you do if you possessed a fortune capable of buying entire islands, yet found yourself paralyzed by the realization that your own home was nothing more than a mausoleum of cold marble and expensive silence? Arthur Sterling never imagined that such a specific, haunting realization would strike him on a Tuesday night. Nor did he imagine that the antidote to his existential poverty would be found in the trembling hands of a woman holding a single, flickering candle. In the cavernous, industrial-grade kitchen of his sprawling vineyard estate in Napa Valley, Clara was about to make a wish that felt less like a hope and more like a final plea to a universe that seemed to have forgotten her name. Before we walk down the long, shadowed corridors of Arthur's estate, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. If you have ever felt that specific aching solitude that comes even when you are surrounded by people, or if you believe that the most profound connections often start in the quietest moments, join our community. We explore the stories that remind us we are human. Now, let the silence of the Sterling estate wrap around you as we begin. The grandfather clock in the main foyer, a towering sentinel of mahogany and brass that had belonged to a 19th-century duke, chimed the half-hour past 9. The sound reverberated through the house, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate against the very bones of the structure. For Clara, the sound marked the official end of a shift that had begun before the sun had even considered cresting the rolling hills of the vineyard. She stood at the deep farmhouse sink, the water warm against her skin, scrubbing the remnants of a meal she hadn't eaten off a plate that cost more than her rent for an entire year. Her hands, red and chapped despite the lotion she applied religiously every night, moved with the muscle memory of 5 years of service. She dried the fine bone china with a linen cloth, placing it into the cabinet with a reverence that was born of fear rather than admiration. One slip, one moment of clumsiness, and weeks of wages would vanish. The mansion was suffocatingly quiet. It was a silence that felt heavy, almost pressurized, as if the air itself were made of lead. Arthur Sterling, the master of the estate, and a man whose name was synonymous with the finest Cabernet in the valley, had left before dawn for a crisis meeting in San Francisco. He was a ghost in his own home, a figure who moved through the rooms leaving behind only the scent of expensive cologne and the rustle of important papers. The other staff members, the groundskeepers, the sous chefs, the maids who handled the upper floors, had all departed hours ago, their laughter fading down the driveway as they returned to their families, their partners, their lives. Clara remained. She was always the one who remained, the final sentinel of the household, ensuring that the heart of the home was spotless and cold before she retreated to her small quarters attached to the rear of the garage. Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 12 hours. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was a spiritual fatigue that settled into her marrow. At 31, she felt ancient. She had spent half a decade in this house, surrounded by the kind of luxury that people saw in magazines, yet she felt like an intruder in a museum. The stainless steel appliances gleamed with a judgmental sterility, and the marble countertops were cool to the touch, indifferent to her presence. She untied her apron, the fabric coarse against her fingers, and folded it neatly on the counter. Her eyes, a deep shade of hazel that usually held a spark of resilience, were tonight glossed over with unshed tears. Today was her birthday, and for the 5th year in a row, the only person who would acknowledge it was the reflection staring back at her from the darkened window pane. She walked slowly to her room, a small, functional space that stood in stark contrast to the opulence of the main house. It was clean, sparse, and smelled faintly of lavender and loneliness. On her bedside table sat a framed photograph of her parents, taken just weeks before the fire that had claimed them and the small bakery they owned. That fire had burned away her past, her inheritance, and her future in a single night. She opened the top drawer of her dresser and retrieved a small, dented tin box. Inside lay her savings, a meager collection of bills and coins that represented her slow, agonizing crawl toward a dream she could barely remember. With trembling fingers, she counted out just enough for a single treat. She changed out of her uniform into a simple, soft dress of pale blue cotton, the one her mother had sewn for her, and wrapped a knitted shawl around her shoulders. Looking in the mirror, she whispered, "Happy birthday, Clara." but the words sounded hollow, bouncing off the walls of the empty room like a dropped coin. The night air of the valley was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of turning soil and ripening grapes. Clara slipped out the back gate, avoiding the security sensors she knew by heart, and began the walk toward the small village center, a mile down the road. The stars above were brilliant, unpolluted by city lights, indifferent witnesses to her solitary procession. She passed other estates, their windows glowing with the warmth of family dinners and gathered friends, and a pang of longing pierced her chest so sharply she almost stopped walking. It wasn't the wealth she envied. It was the togetherness. It was the knowledge that behind those gates, someone was asking someone else how their day was. Someone was being listened to, someone was being seen. The village bakery, the hearth, was just preparing to flip its sign to closed when Clara arrived. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose face was a map of wrinkles earned through decades of smiling, looked up as the bell chimed. "Clara, my dear," he said, his voice warm and dusted with flour. "You're late tonight. The darkness doesn't suit a young lady walking alone." Clara offered a small, apologetic smile, pointing toward the display case where a single, small vanilla cupcake sat on a doily. It was simple, topped with a swirl of buttercream and a single candied violet. It's a special occasion, Mr. Abernathy," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the hum of the display fridge. The old baker paused, his eyes softening as he recognized the date. "Ah, the 24th, I should have remembered." He reached into the case, bypassing the tongs and lifting the cupcake with a gentle, gloved hand. He placed it in a small white box and before sealing it, tucked a small white candle inside. "On the house, Clara. And don't you dare argue with me," he said firmly when he saw her reaching for her coin purse. "But you must promise me one thing, make a wish that scares you. Don't waste a birthday candle on something safe." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She nodded, unable to speak, and took the box as if it contained the crown jewels. She walked back to the estate, the box pressed against her heart, the wind picking up and rustling the vines that stretched out in endless, regimented rows like silent soldiers. Back in the main kitchen, Clara didn't go to her room. She couldn't bear the confinement of those 4 small walls, not tonight. Instead, she set the cupcake on the butcher block island in the center of the vast kitchen. She left the overhead lights off, allowing only the moonlight spilling through the skylights to illuminate the room. She struck a match, the sulfur flare brief and bright, and lit the small white candle. The flame danced, a tiny beacon of defiance against the encroaching dark. She pulled up a high stool and sat, her chin resting in her hands, watching the wax begin to pool. She thought of Mr. Abernathy's advice. Make a wish that scares you. For 10 years, her wish had been stability, safety, survival. But tonight, looking at the solitary flame, she realized those things weren't enough anymore. She closed her eyes and whispered her wish into the silence, a wish so fragile she was afraid to give it a voice. "I don't want to be invisible anymore." A single tear escaped, tracking a hot path down her cool cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "Happy birthday, Clara," she whispered again, preparing to blow out the candle and extinguish the only warmth in the room. She didn't hear the hum of the engine. The sleek, black luxury sedan had glided up the long driveway, tires crunching softly on the gravel, delivering Arthur Sterling back to his fortress. He stepped out of the car, his body aching with the specific tension that comes from 12 hours of high-stakes negotiation. At 56, Arthur was a titan of industry, a man who had turned a failing family plot into a global wine empire. But the empire was a cold companion. He dismissed his driver with a nod and a generous tip, standing for a moment at the foot of the stairs that led to his front door. He looked up at the facade of his home, a breathtaking example of modern architecture, glass and stone and timber, and felt absolutely nothing. No joy, no relief, no sense of sanctuary. Just the knowledge that he was entering a space that was perfectly climate-controlled and perfectly empty. Arthur loosened his silk tie, the knot slipping down his neck, and sighed. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away 4 years ago. Their marriage had been a partnership of convenience and mutual respect, but it had lacked the fiery core of passion he read about in books. Since her death, he had retreated into work, building walls of money and influence to keep the world at bay. He walked to the front door, his hand on the biometric scanner, but stopped. A faint, flickering glow was coming from the kitchen windows at the side of the house. It was an erratic, warm light, unlike the cold LEDs of the security system. A frown creased his forehead. The staff should have been gone hours ago. Was it an electrical fault, an intruder, curiosity, a sensation he rarely felt these days, pulled him away from the front door and around the side of the house? He moved quietly, his Italian leather shoes making no sound on the flagstone path. The scent of jasmine was overpowering in the night air, a sweet, cloying perfume that reminded him of funerals. He reached the tall windows of the kitchen and peered through the glass. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. Inside, illuminated only by the fragile light of a single candle, sat Clara. He recognized her, of course. She was the quiet, efficient woman who ensured his coffee was the perfect temperature, and his shirts were pressed to razor-sharp perfection. But he realized with a jolt of shame that he had never truly seen her. He saw a uniform, a function, a payroll number. Tonight, through the glass, he saw a woman. She was sitting slumped at the island, her face bathed in the golden glow, staring at a tiny cupcake with an expression of such profound, devastating loneliness that it felt like a physical blow to Arthur's chest. He watched as a tear fell from her eye, catching the light like a falling star. He stood there frozen in the garden, feeling like a voyeur to a sacred, private tragedy. The image of her, so small in his massive, expensive kitchen, celebrating her existence with a confectionery crumb while surrounded by his hoard of wealth, shattered something calcified within him. He looked at his own reflection in the darkened glass. A man in a $5,000 suit who had no one to wish him good night, staring at a woman with $10 to her name who had no one to wish her happy birthday. The symmetry of their isolation was perfect and terrible. Arthur knew he should walk away. He should go to his study, pour a glass of his rarest vintage, and pretend he hadn't seen this. That was the protocol, that was the boundary, but his feet wouldn't move. A strange impulse, alien and terrifying, rose in his throat. He couldn't leave her there in the dark. He couldn't let that candle burn out without a witness. He moved toward the side door, his hand trembling slightly as he turned the handle. The click of the latch was loud in the silence. Clara jumped, spinning on the stool, her eyes wide with panic. She scrambled to her feet, frantically wiping her face, trying to compose herself, to put the mask of the servant back on. "Mr. Sterling, I didn't know you were back. I'm so sorry. I'll clean this up immediately." Her voice shook and she reached to blow out the candle, to erase the evidence of her humanity. "Don't," Arthur said. His voice was rough, unused to softness, but he held up a hand. "Don't blow it out." Clara froze, her hand hovering near the flame. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the imperious master of the estate, but a man with tired eyes and slumping shoulders, standing in the doorway, looking lost. "Sir?" Arthur stepped into the kitchen, the door clicking shut behind him, sealing them in together. "It's your birthday," he stated, not as a question but as a realization. Clara looked down at the floor, shame burning her cheeks. "Yes, sir. I apologize for using the kitchen. I didn't mean to intrude." "Intrude?" Arthur let out a dry, mirthless laugh. "Clara, you spend more time in this room than I do." "If anyone is an intruder here, it's me." He walked slowly toward the island, shedding his suit jacket and draping it over one of the pristine chairs. He loosened his tie further and unbuttoned his collar. The distance between them felt like a canyon, bridged only by the flickering light of the candle. He looked at the cupcake, then at her. He hesitated. The words felt clumsy, like a foreign language he was trying to learn on the fly. "I don't suppose, would you mind if I sat with you?" The question hung in the air, absurd and heavy. Clara stared at him, her mind unable to process the request. The Arthur Sterling she knew spoke in commands, in schedules, in critiques. He did not ask for permission to sit in his own house. "Sir, you want to sit?" "I don't want to sit alone," he corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And I don't think you do either." Clara hesitated, her training warring with her heart. Finally, she nodded slowly. Okay. Arthur pulled out the stool opposite her. The marble island, usually a barrier between the server and the served, became a table between two people. He looked at the candle. Make a wish, he said gently. You haven't blown it out yet. Clara looked at him, then back at the flame. The fear she had felt earlier began to recede, replaced by a surreal sense of calm. She closed her eyes again, and this time her wish was different. She didn't wish to be seen, she wished to know the person sitting across from her. She blew out the candle. The smoke curled up in a thin grey ribbon, smelling of burnt sugar and wax. Happy birthday, Clara, Arthur said. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. Arthur, he corrected. Please, tonight, just Arthur. She looked up, startled. Arthur. She tested the name. It felt heavy and real. How old are you today? He asked, watching her carefully. 31, she replied. She reached for the plastic knife she had brought from the bakery to cut the cupcake. And you, when is your birthday? Arthur blinked. He had to think about it. 2 months ago, I turned 56. Did you have a party? Clara asked, dividing the tiny cake into 2 equal halves. Arthur looked at the ceiling, remembering. I was in Tokyo. I think I had a conference call that lasted until 3:00 a.m. My assistant sent me a bottle of scotch. I drank a glass alone in the hotel room and went to sleep. Clara pushed one half of the cupcake toward him on a paper napkin. That sounds very lonely, she said honestly. It was, Arthur admitted. He looked at the half cupcake. It was a pathetic amount of food for a grown man, yet it looked more appetizing than the 5-course dinners he was usually served at galas. He picked it up. Thank you. They ate in silence for a moment, the sweetness of the vanilla frosting exploding on their tongues. It was a shared communion, a breaking of bread that dismantled the hierarchy between them. Tell me about yourself, Clara, Arthur said, wiping a crumb from his lip. I realize tonight that I know nothing about you, and that is a failure on my part that I intend to rectify. Clara shifted on her stool. There isn't much to tell. I grew up in a small town north of here. My parents were bakers. Is that why you chose this cupcake? She smiled, a sad, fleeting thing. Yes, my father used to make these. He said vanilla was the hardest flavor to get right because it has nowhere to hide. If the ingredients aren't pure, you taste the mistake immediately. And what happened to them? Arthur asked, his voice soft. Clara looked at her hands. A fire. 12 years ago. I lost them, the shop, everything. I didn't have the money to rebuild, so I started working. Cleaning, cooking. I moved from house to house until I ended up here. Arthur listened, his heart aching. He looked at the woman before him, a survivor who had carried her grief with such quiet dignity that he had mistaken it for submissiveness. You have a dream, though, he said. I can see it in your eyes. You don't want to be cleaning houses forever. Clara looked up, surprised by his perceptiveness. I want a garden, she confessed. Not a landscaped estate like this, a real garden. Vegetables, herbs, fruit trees. I want to grow things that feed people. I want to get my hands in the dirt and create life. Arthur leaned forward. Why haven't you? Land is expensive, Arthur, and dreams don't pay the rent. The use of his first name sent a shiver through him. It sounded right. I understand, he said. I used to have dreams like that, before the business took over, before Eleanor died. Your wife, Clara said softly. I remember the day of the funeral. You looked like you were made of stone. I felt like stone, Arthur admitted. I shut down. I thought if I didn't feel anything, the pain couldn't destroy me. But I realized tonight, watching you through that window, stone doesn't live. It just exists, and I am tired of just existing. They talked for hours. The moon tracked its arc across the sky, and the darkness of the kitchen became a protective cocoon. They spoke of lost loves, of the specific regrets that keep them awake at 3:00 a.m., of the books they read in secret. Arthur discovered that Clara had a sharp wit and a deep love for Victorian poetry. Clara discovered that Arthur Beneath his armor of wealth was a man who loved jazz music and regretted never learning to play the saxophone. By the time the grandfather clock chimed 2:00 a.m., the atmosphere in the kitchen had shifted irrevocably. The employer-employee dynamic had dissolved, replaced by a fragile, tentative connection between two lonely souls who had found a raft in the middle of an ocean. "I should let you sleep," Arthur said, standing up. He felt lighter than he had in years. "You have work tomorrow." He paused. "Actually, you don't. Take tomorrow off, paid. That's an order." Clara stood up, her legs stiff but her heart racing. "Thank you, Arthur. For the company. It was the best birthday present I could have asked for." Arthur looked at her, his grey eyes intense. "Clara, I promise you, you will never spend a birthday alone again. Not if I have anything to say about it." He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. His skin was rougher than she expected, warm and firm. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Arthur." The next few weeks were a strange, dizzying dance. The household ran as it always had, but the undercurrents had changed. Clara would find small things left for her in the places she worked. A book of poetry by Keats left on the library table with a bookmark sticking out. A single, perfect camellia from the greenhouse left in a vase in the kitchen. Notes written on heavy, cream-colored cardstock. "I listened to that Miles Davis album you mentioned. You were right about the trumpet solo." Arthur began to eat breakfast in the kitchen. He dismissed the other staff, insisting he wanted to read the paper in peace. But in reality, he just wanted to sit near Clara while she prepped the vegetables. They spoke in low tones, sharing jokes and observations, building a private world within the walls of the mansion. The other staff noticed the change, the way the master of the house softened when the housekeeper entered the room, the way Clara hummed while she worked. But they said nothing. However, the world outside the estate was not so kind. A month after the birthday, Arthur hosted a luncheon for several high-profile investors and local vineyard owners. It was a high-stakes event, intended to secure a merger that would expand the Sterling Empire. Clara was serving, moving silently around the long mahogany table, pouring wine and clearing plates. One of the guests, a man named Marcus Vane, new money, loud and arrogant, snapped his fingers at Clara as she passed. "Hey you, this steak is tough, take it back." Clara froze. "I apologize, sir, I will speak to the chef immediately." Vane sneered, his face flushed with too much wine. "Don't just speak to him, get me a new one, and hurry up. God, it's so hard to find competent help these days. They barely understand English half the time. Do they, Arthur?" The table went silent. Vane's comment hung in the air, ugly and crass. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the plate, her knuckles white, preparing to absorb the insult as she had absorbed 1,000 others in her life. She turned to leave. "Clara, stop." Arthur's voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that froze the room. He was sitting at the head of the table, his glass of wine halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly. The crystal made a sharp clink against the wood. "Excuse me?" Vane laughed nervously. "I'm just saying, Arthur, you have to keep them in line." Arthur stood up. He was a tall man, and in that moment he looked 10 feet tall. He walked down the length of the table until he stood directly behind Clara. He didn't look at Vane. He looked at Clara. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I'm fine, sir," she whispered, her eyes downcast. "No, you are not fine," Arthur said. He turned to Vane, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "Mr. Vane, the woman standing here is not help. She is the heart of this home. She is intelligent, she is kind, and she possesses more class in her little finger than you possess in your entire bank account." Vane sputtered. "Arthur, come on, it's just a joke. Don't ruin the deal over a maid." "The deal is dead," Arthur said, his voice deadly calm. "Get out of my house, and do not ever step foot on my property again." "You're crazy." Vane stood up, knocking his chair over. "You're throwing away millions." "I am throwing away garbage," Arthur retorted. "Now get out!" Clara watched, stunned, as Vane stormed out, followed by an awkward silence from the remaining guests. Arthur turned to them. "I apologize for the disruption. Dessert will be served on the terrace. Clara will not be serving you. She will be joining me in the study." He took Clara's arm and led her out of the dining room, leaving the guests staring in disbelief. In the hallway, Clara pulled away, her breath coming in short gasps. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You lost the deal. You humiliated him." "He humiliated you," Arthur said, reaching for her. "Clara, I don't care about the deal. I don't care about the money. I realized something when he spoke to you like that. I wanted to tear the world apart to protect you." "Why?" Clara cried. I'm just me." "Because I love you," Arthur said. The words tumbled out, unplanned, raw, and undeniable. "I have loved you since the moment I sat on that stool in the kitchen. I love the way you look at the sunset. I love your resilience. I love you, Clara." Clara stared at him, terror and hope warring in her chest. "You can't love me, Arthur. This is a fantasy. Tomorrow you'll wake up and realize I'm poor, uneducated, and 20 years younger than you. You'll realize I don't fit in your world." "Then I will build a new world," Arthur vowed, stepping closer. "Clara, look at me. Is this a fantasy?" He took her face in his hands, his touch tender and desperate. "Does this feel like a fantasy?" He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative kiss like the one they might have imagined. It was a kiss of pouring rain after a drought, a kiss of total surrender. Clara felt her defenses crumbling, the walls she had built to survive turning to dust. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the only man who had ever truly fought for her. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "I'm scared to death, but I love you." "We'll be scared together," Arthur promised, "but we will never be lonely again." The seasons turned. The vineyards went from the dormant grey of winter to the vibrant burst of spring budbreak. The relationship between Arthur and Clara blossomed in the shelter of the estate, but they knew they couldn't hide forever. Arthur introduced Clara to his world not as his housekeeper, but as his partner. There were whispers, of course. Society columns made snide remarks about the millionaire and the maid. But Arthur held his head high, and with Clara by his side, her grace and intelligence silencing the critics one by one, the gossip eventually turned to admiration. But Arthur had one more promise to keep. A year to the day of that lonely birthday, Arthur told Clara to dress for dinner. He blindfolded her in the car, driving for hours, while she laughed and tried to guess where they were going. When the car finally stopped, the air smelled different, saltier, mixed with the scent of pine. "Trust me," Arthur whispered, helping her out of the car. He guided her a few steps, then untied the silk blindfold. Clara opened her eyes and gasped. They were standing in front of a small, charming building with large bay windows and a sign swinging in the breeze. The Phoenix Bakery. Through the windows, she could see display cases filled with pastries, ovens ready to be fired, and a small garden in the back bursting with herbs and flowers. It looks just like..." Clara couldn't finish the sentence. "I found the blueprints of your father's shop," Arthur explained, standing behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist. "I couldn't bring them back, Clara, but I could bring back their dream. This is yours. The deed is in your name. You're not going to cook for me anymore. You're going to cook for the world." Clara fell to her knees, sobbing with a joy so intense it felt like pain. This man, who had once been a stranger in a suit, had listened to every word she had ever said. He had rebuilt her past to give her a future. Arthur knelt beside her. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was not a massive diamond, but a ring featuring a rare, violet-colored sapphire, the color of the candied flower on that first cupcake. "Clara," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion, "you saved me from a life of expensive silence. You taught me that wealth isn't what you own, but who you share it with. Will you marry me? Will you plant your garden with me?" Clara looked at the bakery, then at the ring, and finally at the man who had seen her when she was invisible. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing out into the coastal air. "Yes, Arthur, 1,000 times yes." 5 years later, the kitchen of the Sterling estate was no longer silent. It was a chaotic, joyous mess of flour and laughter. A toddler, his face smeared with chocolate, was banging a wooden spoon against a pot, while Arthur, now 61 but looking 10 years younger, tried to corral him. "Clara! He's escaped again!" Arthur laughed, scooping the boy up. Clara walked in from the garden, a basket of fresh tomatoes and basil in her arms. Her hair was loose, her face radiant, the lines of exhaustion long erased by years of love and purpose. She looked at her husband and her son, the late afternoon sun bathing them in a warm, golden light. She set the basket down and walked over to Arthur, kissing him gently. She glanced at the calendar on the wall. It was September 24th. "Happy birthday, my love," Arthur whispered. Clara looked around the room, filled with noise, with life, with love. She thought back to the single candle and the desperate wish. "I don't need to make a wish this year," she smiled, taking her son's small hand. "I already have everything I ever wanted." This story is a reminder that sometimes the person who will change your life is standing right in front of you, waiting to be seen. It reminds us that labels like rich and poor are costumes we wear, but underneath, we all hunger for the same connection. If Arthur and Clara's journey touched your heart, please share this video with someone you love. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments. Have you ever had a chance encounter that changed your destiny? Let's build a community where every story matters. Remember, you are never truly alone, and your story is just waiting for the right moment to begin. Until next time, take care of each other.